All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another deep dive with us.
It's good to be here.
For this one, we're going to crank it up to 11.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to dive into a question that has haunted rock music since practically forever. Is rock's connection to the devil real, or is it all just smoke and mirrors?
It's a question that digs beneath the surface of image and sound, that's for sure.
Yeah. And to get to the bottom of this, we've got a pretty wild mix of sources here today. We've got a Reddit discussion about country music controversy. We have a podcast that is dissecting rock history's dark side, an article tracing the devil's musical influence across genres, and another Reddit thread about the use of hell as a visual in rock.
Quite a range and potentially insightful. After all, you might be surprised how much country music and rock and roll share when it comes to courting controversy.
That's actually exactly what caught my eye in that Reddit discussion. Somebody pointed out how a bunch of new country songs are stirring up debate with their right-leaning politics. It got me thinking, haven't we seen this song and dance before?
It's fascinating how music often becomes a battleground for cultural anxieties. That article on Music and the Devil highlights how this devil's music label gets slapped onto anything new and edgy. Jazz in the early 1900s got hit with the same accusations. Remember Jelly Roll Morton getting kicked out by his grandma for playing?
Really, all that just for tickling the ivories?
The saxophone was even banned by the Pope. Society often freaks out when music challenges the status quo.
Wild how history repeats itself. But with rock, it seems to go deeper than just rattling the establishment. There's this whole idea of musicians literally making deals with the devil, the most famous one being Robert Johnson, right? Meeting the devil at the crossroads and selling his soul for insane guitar skills.
Ah, the crossroads myth. It's not just a cool story. It's practically become this blueprint for how we view blues and, by extension, rock music. Think about all the songs and movies it's inspired. It's seeped into our cultural DNA.
And that image got amplified with rock and roll. Elvis, shaking his hips, was practically seen as demonic back in the day.
Elvis, Little Richard, Chuck Berry. They were all seen as threats to good morals, pushing that devil's music narrative even further. Then came the British invasion, with bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones pushing boundaries even further.
Whoa, yeah. The Beatles had Aleister Crowley the Occultist on their Steep Pepper album cover. And don't even get me started on the Rolling Stones, their Satanic Majesty's Request. That was practically a declaration. And let's not forget Sympathy for the Devil. Mick Jagger strutting around like Lucifer himself.
Mick certainly knew how to put on a show, though we should remember that even Sympathy for the Devil has a deeper layer. Marianne Faithfull suggested Jagger wasn't literally praising Satan, but exploring the concept of evil throughout history.
So playing with fire but not actually getting burned, that kind of leads us to the whole metal scene and those bands that seem to embrace satanic imagery full on. Think Black Sabbath, Marilyn Manson. Were they really devil worshippers, or was it all a big publicity stunt?
The podcast we have dives into that question, and it quickly gets complicated. Some artists were clearly into the occult, while others were arguably playing a character using shock value to sell records.
Which makes you wonder who was really pulling the strings. Were these bands pushing the dark stuff because they genuinely believed it, or were they pressured by labels or something?
That's a question that still sparks debate. And speaking of visual impact, remember that Reddit thread about hell as an aesthetic in rock. What's interesting is that those images were first used as a way to reclaim the devil's music label, turning it into a badge of honor.
Right, like Black Sabbath with their heavy sound and lyrics about darkness. They weren't shying away from the label, they were owning it.
And it's important to remember this was happening during a time when society was already on edge about rock music's influence. Then came the 1980s and the whole satanic panic.
Oh yeah, the time when people thought heavy metal was going to summon actual demons. Was that all just media hype, or was there something more to it?
It was a perfect storm of fear, misunderstanding, and media sensationalism. The podcast we have actually features interviews with people who lived through it, and their stories are pretty wild.
So was there any truth to the accusations? Was heavy metal really a gateway to devil worship?
The reality is far more nuanced. While some bands did dabble in occult themes, the vast majority were simply using imagery and lyrics to express rebellion and angst, but the media, often lacking context or understanding, blew it all out of proportion, creating this image of heavy metal as a dangerous satanic force.
And that fear-mongering had real-world consequences, right? Didn't people actually get blamed for crimes and stuff because they listened to metal?
Absolutely. There were court cases, censorship attempts, and even accusations of bands inciting violence or ritualistic behavior. It was a dark chapter in music history, fueled by a potent mix of ignorance, and moral panic.
Makes you wonder if those bands ever regretted pushing things so far. I mean, did they feel responsible for the chaos that followed?
That's where the lines get blurry. The podcast actually suggests that some of those satanic bands later admitted they didn't actually believe in what they were singing about.
Whoa, seriously.
Yeah.
So it was all an act. Kind of risky move considering the whole satanic panic thing going on.
It raises an interesting ethical question. At what point does an image stop being just an image? Do artists have a responsibility for the potential consequences of their creative choices, even if those choices are primarily driven by marketing or shock value?
Well, who benefited the most from all this devil worship hype? I mean, besides the media whipping everyone into a frenzy.
That's a good question. The podcast suggests that often it wasn't the bands themselves who profited the most from the controversy, but the record labels, marketing firms, and yes, even the media. Sensationalism sells, and they knew how to exploit the public's fascination with the taboo.
So cynical. Using something as powerful as fear and religious beliefs to make a buck.
It speaks to the commodification of rebellion, how easily counterculture can be packaged and sold for profit. And speaking of commodification, let's loop back to the historical article. It talks about how the devil became the central figure in heavy metal, particularly in the 70s and 80s.
Bands like Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Metallica, they were all over MTV with their dark imagery and lyrics. I bet that caused a stir back then.
Oh, absolutely. Conservative groups and religious organizations were up in arms. They saw it as a threat to traditional values, a gateway to devil worship. It all fed into that whole satanic panic we were talking about.
It's mind-blowing how easily people can be convinced that something as harmless as music can be dangerous.
Fear is a powerful tool, especially when it's amplified by misinformation and a lack of understanding.
But the article also mentions that not all music about the devil is meant to be taken literally. There are tons of songs where the devil is more of a metaphor or a character in a story, right?
Right. Think about traditional folk songs like Whiskey in the Jar, or blues classics like Robert Johnson's Hellhound on My Trail. The devil has been a recurring character in music long before heavy metal, often representing temptation, crossroads, and the darker side of human nature.
So maybe it's not always about actual devil worship, but more about tapping into these archetypes of rebellion, desire, and the struggle between good and evil, sort of like how we find those themes in literature and art too.
Exactly. The devil as a symbol represents something primal and powerful, a way to explore those taboo aspects of the human experience. And rock music, with its intensity and energy, provides a unique space for that exploration.
Which brings us back to that Reddit thread about hell as an aesthetic.
Yeah.
People seem drawn to these images even if they don't believe in the literal concept of hell.
What's fascinating is how this imagery has evolved from being purely controversial to becoming a widely accepted part of rock culture.
Yeah, it's like those devil horns people throw up at concerts. They're not about summoning demons, they're about showing excitement, belonging, being part of the tribe.
Precisely. The imagery has become somewhat detached from its original religious meaning, taking on a new significance in the context of rock and roll.
It's almost like hell has been repurposed by rock music, becoming a symbol of rebellion and nonconformity. Not about fire and brimstone, but something else entirely.
In a way, yes, it's about embracing those darker, more visceral aspects of human experience, challenging the status quo and saying, we're not playing by your rules.
Like how those heavy metal bands use skulls, demons, and hellfire to project the sense of power and defiance.
Exactly. And while this imagery might have been shocking decades ago, it's so ingrained in rock culture now that it's lost a lot of its power to offend.
Which is ironic, right? The very thing meant to scare people has become a symbol of unity for rock fans.
It's a great example of how culture evolves and how symbols can take on new meanings over time.
This is all mind-blowing. Music can be so layered with meaning and history.
And there's always more to uncover, more to explore beneath the surface of what we think we know.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface of this devilishly complex topic.
Indeed. And perhaps that's the best way to leave our listeners with a sense of curiosity and a desire to delve deeper into rock music's fascination with the dark side.
So we've explored how rock music has flirted with the devil, played with fire, and even gotten burned a few times. But after all this, I'm wondering, what's the takeaway? Is the devil in rock music this external force trying to corrupt us all, or is there something else going on?
That's where things get really intriguing. What if this fascination with the devil in rock music is less about actual evil and more about us, about humanity's shadow self, those parts of ourselves we're told to hide the desires and anxieties society tries to suppress?
Okay, so maybe it's not about worshiping Satan, but about exploring the darker sides of human nature that we all have. Sort of like looking into a funhouse mirror, distorted but still reflecting something real.
Precisely. Rock music, with its intensity and raw energy, can provide a safe space to confront those darker impulses, to channel those emotions into something creative and cathartic. It's like how some people enjoy horror movies. Not because they want bad things to happen, but because it allows them to engage with fear and darkness in a controlled environment.
That makes sense. It's like rock music gives us permission to explore those taboo feelings without judgment. But if that's the case, why has rock music been so demonized throughout history?
Because those darker aspects of ourselves, the ones that rock music often reflects, are the very things that make society uncomfortable. It challenges the neat, tidy boxes we try to put ourselves and others into.
So rock music becomes the scapegoat, the easy target for people's anxieties about things they don't understand or want to admit exist within themselves.
It's a fascinating paradox. Rock music gets labeled as dangerous and devilish, but maybe it's actually helping us to become more whole, more accepting of our own complexity as human beings.
This whole deep dive has really flipped my perspective. I used to think the devil in rock music was just a cheap trick, a way to grab attention. Now I see it as something much deeper, more about exploring who we are, shadows and all.
It's a reflection of our cultural anxieties, our fascination with the forbidden, and our own internal struggles. And by engaging with those darker themes through music, art, or literature, perhaps we can move towards a more honest and nuanced understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Well said. So to wrap things up, what's the one thing you'd want our listeners to walk away with after this deep dive?
Next time you hear a song with devilish imagery or a rebellious spirit, don't just dismiss it as shock value. Consider the deeper meanings that cultural forces and maybe even your own shadow self reflected in the music.
Love that.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that music is more than just entertainment. It's a mirror to our souls, both the light and the dark. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the devilish depths of rock music.
It's been my pleasure. Until next time, keep rocking, keep questioning, and never be afraid to explore the shadows.